on the chickens. That's one legend that he narrates. In another book, I found that the manifesto was written on cigarette rolling papers. This is more unlikely to be believed because that cigarette must have been very, very long to write on the little papers all the story. But you see how theory and praxis were very, very close at that time. So we find a man who is on a voyage to become post-Marxist or post-communist, but clearly a loser in the middle of the war where everyone was lost. And every morning they could see more and more people, even in jail, greeting the guards with the fascist salute. And Spinelli and others were very few. They were still sticking to their guns, but everything looked lost. The other person who wrote the manifesto, I said the manifesto was E-R and A-S and E-R, was a professor of economics, a secondary school professor, not someone who had a university position, Ernesto Rossi, who believed in markets, but not necessarily in their historical, contingent manifestations of capitalism. So it was an idea of markets, but not of monopolies, of large firms, and with a strong sense also of using markets for social justice. So his idea was to break down concentration of economic power dangerous to individual liberties, including the unions. You might not expect someone to have strong words against the union, but the manifesto also has some strong words against the unions. He was not therefore for the unfettered forces of the markets, and indeed he was rooted in an Italian tradition called socialismo liberale or liberal socialismo, which means liberal and socialist. Like in every good story, we need a human now, and I hope I'm not taking too much time. So the human is a fine Germanist, someone who knows about German literature, and she was a German woman, was just more or less your age, 20-something, called Ursula Hirschman. And Ursula Hirschman went to the island with her husband, Eugenio Colorni, the third person who contributed to the manifesto, a philosopher, a Jew who lived in Germany and then moved with Ursula to Italy, where they essentially became activists against fascism. We're speaking of movements with, they gathered hundreds of people. The big Italian resistance started later in 1943. At this time, there were just pockets of people. Ursula already had 2 little girls. She had a third during the time of the story I'm telling you. And she's very important in our story for one reason, that she brought the manifesto out of the island, because she could travel outside the island, to the mainland, first in Rome, Milan, then Geneva, so that there was a big international movement of expats that could comment on the manifesto. So the manifesto was peer-reviewed. That's good. It was peer-reviewed by other people between 1941 and 1944. That's why there is a 1943 edition and a 1944. One was the revised and resubmit, and then was the final accepted paper for publication, if you want to think academic. When Altiero Spinelli saw Ursula Hirschman for the first time on the island with her long hair, very young, he said that he understood why the people from Florence in the 12th century described these women Madonna. When you see all these paintings from the 12th, 13th century, early paintings from Florence, it's still now the Florentines call very beautiful women the Madonna. There was also therefore some, not tension, but clearly Spinelli was attracted by this woman, but she was the wife of Colorni, who was then killed in 1944 by the Koch brigade of the Nazis in the streets of Rome, still split between the partisans and the German troops. So we got every ingredient to carry on and talk about the manifesto. We have the second scene. Now we look at the content. That's the academic input I'm going to give you. Look at some key concepts, and then so time for you to, let's see what I have. Yes, to tell me what you think. So we are now in the third scene where we talk about the manifesto. We said about the historical period. And here we need to enter something that is very poetic, that doesn't come from the manifesto, but other things that Spinelli wrote. And it's the idea of, he called it the nocturnal language, the language of the night. He said, I have two languages, the day language and the nocturnal language. The nocturnal language is very important, he said, not because Spinelli was a mystic person or someone lost in, thinking of human peace or nothing like that. It's important because the night gives you perspective. And we're speaking of nights in jail, with the wind and the sea raging outside the jail. But it's not pleasant. Although it's Italy, don't think of romantic islands. It's quite a tough period. So this language that enabled him to think is simply detached from, he says, I'm quoting, one owns personality and one's own faith. The nocturnal language, says Spinelli, is distaccato, which is Italian, but it means detached in Italian, but it has the same roots of distance, so perspective, and perspective is also vision in this case. It has nothing to do with the contingent fact of being in jail and with the contingent fact of Europe being swept by the army of the Third Reich. But it is deeper, therefore, than the reality that we see today. You can think also of two characters in Shakespeare, Ariel and Caliban, where Ariel is poetry, art, levitation, and Caliban is compromise and reality. The language of the day is kind of Caliban. It's a realist language. Spinelli says it's the language that weighs the existing forces, that calculates how we can move them as levers, operate on the forces of today, and in which direction. But, he adds, to speak confidently this language of the day, we need first to know the language of the night, this nocturnal language, because this is the language in which we pin down at night the major themes that then we will elaborate during the day. So that's his idea of theory and praxis. It's very, very, very poetic. The language of the night, he says in Italian, il succoso alimento, the juicy aliment, the juicy food, pieno di misteriosa forza nutritiva, full of mysterious nutrient force. And then he says, this is what gives to the language of the day its own nutrients, its own food. Okay, this is essentially how because I think we have to think that someone in jail in that condition, a clear loser, would never think of writing something like the Ventotene Manifesto. But that's how we did it. The overarching, now we look at the concepts. The first concept is the meta concept, and it's the overarching idea is to redefine the center of gravity of European politics, redefine the major cleavage in European politics. He says this major cleavage will not be domestic anymore. It's not left and right. It's not democracy in Italy or democracy in Germany. It is essentially global politics. And within global politics, we see Europe as an interesting part of the world where to experiment